Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Adamson. I'm the chairman of Forum Europe, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event entitled A Call for Bold Regional and Global Actions to Reduce Black Carbon Emissions Impacting the Arctic. As we all know, the Arctic is now very well recognized as a region of global importance for the impacts of climate change. And led by a group of expert organizations, the EU-funded Action on Black Carbon in the Arctic is contributing to the development of collective responses that reduce black carbon emissions affecting the Arctic by engaging with a broad group of regional and global stakeholders and countries to identify feasible ways of taking joint actions. This initiative has contributed to increased knowledge and guided the development of policy options on national, regional, and international actions which can reduce black carbon emissions impacting the Arctic. This virtual forum will present recent advances in knowledge on current and future scenarios, black carbon emission reduction strategies, and help to identify areas where regional and global collaboration can be enhanced. And an international panel will stimulate discussion on where and to what degree bold actions can be undertaken to curb black carbon emissions impacting the Arctic region and other parts of the world. My first great pleasure is to welcome Uffe Jensen, who's a senior expert at the Service for Foreign Policy Instruments, who's taking the place of Dr. Hilde Hardeman, who unfortunately is unwell today. So with my great pleasure and my great gratitude to you, Uffe, I give you the floor. Welcome.
Thank you, Paul. Dear participants, dear colleagues, I'm very pleased to be here today to open this forum on behalf of Hilde Hardeman, who is the head of Service for Foreign Policy Instruments. Unfortunately, Hilde could not be here today, but she has asked me to send her warm greetings and also her great appreciation for the important work that you're all doing. This event is very timely. Just last week, the European Union agreed to cut carbon emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to the 1990 levels. While we are here today, not today to talk about CO2 emissions, climate change is very much at the heart of today's session. Together with the Commission, DG Environment, and the European External Action Service, we launched these actions in 2018 with the Arctic Council's AMAP Secretariat in collaboration with 6 European environmental science institutes. Since we launched it in 2018, global attention to climate change, to air quality and health have increased dramatically, and the impact of these changes on the Arctic have become even more visible. Black carbon is one of the elements which contributes directly to climate change and impacts air quality in the Arctic. We wish to thank the team coordinated by the AMAP Secretariat and the partners from Norway, from Austria, Finland, and Sweden. As a team, you have greatly helped to push and keep black carbon on the agenda in a different national and regional international climate and air quality forum. We have all benefited from your wide network, and the many hats that the team members have had worn have been a great value for the results. Let me highlight your close work with key stakeholders, in particular with the Arctic Council partners and the UNECE Air Convention bodies. We have also been very impressed by your wide outreach, including finding new important partners. Just one example, the contact the project team has established early on with the Arctic, with the partners in Russia, that has resulted in much increased cooperation on black carbon. This is very needed and very important. Working together is the only way that we can fight the climate change and improve air quality. The project team has worked both on policy and on technical levels. In addition to expert work on black carbon emissions, scenarios and projections, technical reports have also provided important and concrete elements to support the policy work. The information and observation capacities and data availability of black carbon emissions in the Arctic, the review of reporting systems for national black carbon emission inventories, and guidance on reducing black carbon emissions from residential heating in the Arctic are a few but very good examples. The important reports have also been translated into Russian. This has made the information available to a much larger and highly important audience. And the final report being discussed here today looks at national, regional, and international policy options to reduce black carbon emission. We are all forced to look forward, and we are forced to work hard and fast and focused in the future. To achieve the target set in Paris and the new objectives agreed last week to cut carbon emission by at least 55% by 2030, we need to continue to work together. Hard work is ahead for all of us to combat climate change, and I personally look very much forward to follow these interesting and fruitful discussions today. So thank you very much and good luck. Back to you, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those opening remarks and stepping in at the last minute. And do give our very best good wishes to Hilda, please, from all of us at the conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you.
And now it's my great pleasure to welcome Michael Mann, who is the EU Special Envoy for Arctic Matters, to give us some opening remarks as well. So, Mr. Ambassador at Large, over to you.
Thanks very much, Paul. Thanks very much indeed. I'd like to start just by echoing the warm welcoming words by both Paul and Uffe today. This excellent project merits everyone's attention, I think, for three main reasons. First, black carbon emissions are a good gauge of the many challenges linked to combating emissions and the ensuing climate change, environmental and health problems. Secondly, black carbon emissions cannot be reduced without understanding that they originate from actions and sources which are important because of the socio-economic activities that underlie them. There are significant arguments to explain why black carbon emissions will not disappear by themselves. Third, this project provides evidence that the challenges can be addressed technically and that it is possible to outline recommendations for meaningful actions to reduce these emissions. The political choices and political will to act is, of course, the next step. Problematic emissions of CO2, methane, and black carbon are not easy to measure precisely, but we can see their overall effects. That leaves a canyon for discussion between the single source and the aggregate problem. This project has demonstrated that data capture is possible, and it is certainly necessary, but it is an enormous task. Work package 1 of this project, under the title Improving the Knowledge Base, has gone some of the way to gathering such data. I shall not expand on the technical details here because I'm sure that other speakers will address these aspects later. A second pillar relates to the reasons why black carbon is produced. Clearly, it's a byproduct and not something that anyone is consciously aiming to produce. But in domestic combustion of wood, coal and diesel, in the flaring of gas, and in wild forest fires, it's a fact that soot and black carbon is produced in vast quantities. These emissions land on ice and snow in the Arctic, which is at the center of attention here. But this problem, of course, also affects the Himalayas, the Alps, the Rocky Mountains, and the Andes. And soot and black carbon also affect air quality in big cities, not least in Asia. This causes health problems for air pollution, which we will not go into further here, but is a major problem. The unintended production of black carbon confronts us with a delicate problem of the socio-economic aspirations behind activities which are aimed at providing energy for housing, electric grids, and transport, but which also cause unintended black carbon emissions. We cannot ignore the socio-economic drivers at play here. They are often not easy to change. But that actually explains the importance of this excellent project. We cannot sit passively and accept this byproduct with all its negative effects, in particular in the climate change context. This takes me to my third point, policy choices and political will. Today's audience will not be surprised if I say that within the climate change debate, the role of mitigation of sources takes a prominent role. Emissions of CO2, methane, and black carbon are a major target. The UN process under the Framework Convention on Climate Change is the core venue. It also comes as no surprise that this work is experiencing both ups and downs. Thus, COP21 in Paris was a success in many respects, but the efforts to follow up with more detailed rules at COP22, 23, 24 and 25 have produced meagre results. Then we saw President Trump withdrawing the US completely from this work. Clearly, it was a time of more downs than ups. Fortunately, the US has re-entered the fray now and held a climate change summit on the 22nd and the 23rd of April, which re-energized, if you'll accept my apologies for the pun, the international debate among principals. That clearly is a major up. Let me now speak of what the EU is doing, because that is currently the real up on the global scene. The deal, as was explained earlier, was reached earlier this month with a commitment to speed up the EU's emissions reductions to levels considered unthinkable just a few years ago. The climate law sets the EU's climate neutrality goal into law. The centerpiece is the goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. Negotiators also agreed to raise the EU's 2030 emissions reduction goal to net 55, which adds 15% to the previous 40% target. The agreement sends a strong signal to the world and paves the way for the Commission's package of proposal under the headline Fit for 55. This is a climate package which is coming out in June. The Black Carbon Project, in its work package 4, Roadmap for Enhanced International Cooperation, aims directly at this spirit, which underlies the overall EU ambitions and I believe sits well with the spirit permeating the Fit for 55 package. As you're aware, we are currently working on an update of the EU's Arctic policy. Climate change and environmental transformation will remain a key pillar. Science and research remain an essential cross-cutting dimension. The issue of black carbon in all its dimensions will be highlighted, and this project is very clearly an important contribution to that. To conclude, I think that the consortium behind the project has done a remarkable job. As for the policy choices, you have given valuable advice, and the political will to take the necessary decisions is growing. But we have to be realistic. It's a massive challenge that still lies ahead of us. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael, Mr. Ambassador. And thank you also for your candor as well. Even though you're a diplomat, you didn't mind speaking quite candidly in your remarks. Thank you very much for that. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Annika Nielsen, who will steer the next part of the program. Annika is a science writer and communications consultant for the EU-funded Action on Black Carbon in the Arctic. So I leave the next of the program in very good hands. Annika, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And this session that we're entering now will feature some of the results from the project. And there are lots of interesting things coming, so I will going to start right away while introducing with short presentation by Karli Kupiainen, Senior Specialist at Finland's Ministry of the Environment. And he will set the stage for us. Why is black carbon a major concern, both in the Arctic and globally? The floor is yours, Karli.
Thank you very much, Annika, and thank you for the invitation to this important event. Great to see you all, great to hear you all, and good to be here. So in my speech, indeed, I will address the question, why is black carbon a major concern in the Arctic and globally? So let us start by examining the Arctic relevance of black carbon by revisiting some of the major scientific findings of the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, or AMAP, as we know it. AMAP is one of the working groups of the Arctic Council, for those who don't know it from beforehand. AMAP has studied this issue of short-lived climate forces, black carbon, methane, etc. in scoping papers and 2 major scientific assessments since 2009. And for your information, the 3rd scientific assessment in the Arctic, or short-lived climate forces in the Arctic, is about to be published in May this year. So what we find as lessons learned in those reports are that, first of all, what comes to assessing impacts and opportunities for mitigation, black carbon also needs to be looked at in a broader context of other air pollutants, greenhouse gases, and their climate and health effects. And this is, in fact, not a novel finding, since such a multi-pollutant, multi-effect approach has been applied for long in several fora. but we definitely see its importance also in the Arctic assessments. Another lesson learned is that when designing policy actions or government interventions, solutions for one pollutant, for example, black carbon, will influence and perhaps reduce also emissions of a suite of other air pollutants and greenhouse gases, and identifying those interconnections and multiple benefits can help to argue for accelerated measures. An important message from the assessments is that the carbon dioxide remains the backbone of any climate policies, also when it comes to the Arctic impacts, but other climate forces also play an important role, including black carbon. And black carbon's effect is particularly pronounced in the Arctic. And why is it so? Black carbon plays a specific role in the Arctic, largely due to the impact pathways related to the darkening of the snow and ice surfaces and consequent accelerated melting. What I also find interesting in the assessments is that part of black carbon's Arctic heating effect is a consequence of black carbon present in more southern latitudes, where it heats the atmosphere and then the heat is transported to the Arctic. So the transport of heat, not necessarily pollutant itself, is an important pathway for climate impacts. And we will soon come back to the conclusions we can actually draw from that. If you look at numbers that we have been informed by AMAP, in 2015, AMAP concluded that mitigation measures reducing particularly black carbon-rich sources could mitigate up to 0.2 or 0.3 degrees of a projected 2-degree climate warming in the Arctic by 2050, if the best available measures would be implemented in full, and up to 0.5 degree when combined with methane reductions. One might argue that such an effect is relatively minor, but tenths of degrees become significant if and hopefully when the world is able to follow the Paris Agreement, implement the required net zero or carbon neutrality commitments, and approach a 1.5 degree world that we have decided upon together. The Arctic Council countries, which are the 8 northernmost countries of the world, account for about 5 to 10% of global anthropogenic emissions, depending a little bit on the year that we looked at. But according to AMAP, they are responsible for about 1/3 of the Arctic warming due to black carbon. Now, this indeed is a significant share and highlights the responsibility of the Arctic states and the significance of the emission sources in the high north. But on the other hand, the rest, 70% of the heating, comes from outside the region, among others from Asia. And this brings me to the second element of my title, the global concern. Now, first of all, even if we hold an Arctic impact perspective, we find that to achieve the climate benefits proposed by AMAP, we need significant additional emission reductions via adoption of best available technologies worldwide. This remains a big challenge, and even though solutions exist, scaling up them seems to be taking its time. Secondly, similarly as for the Arctic, accelerated melting induced by black carbon deposition is also a concern for other snow and ice-covered regions of the world, some of which are relevant as water supplies for vast amounts of people or have tourism as an important economic sector. This was also highlighted in the speech by His Excellency Ambassador Mann. But black carbon is a grave global concern also outside of the Arctic context. It is a dangerous local air pollutant, one of the major constituents of the so-called PM2.5 or fine airborne particles. It's responsible for the most severe human health effects associated with air pollution, morbidity and premature mortality. PM2.5 and black carbon are well-known concerns for air quality and human health in cities and communities worldwide. Their emission reductions would bring about significant benefits for local air quality and human health all over the world, not only in the Arctic. I hope that I have conveyed clearly the argument why black carbon has a particular importance for the Arctic climate, and even while keeping this context, why we need to think global. We need cooperation beyond regions globally, and currently there are relatively many policy and science paths addressing black carbon, methane, short-lived climate pollutants, etc., from regional or more global perspective. And even though perhaps all of these initiatives and processes have their own well-defined mandates and modalities, I would still say that mapping them, bringing these together to exchange information and coordinate in one way or another would be extremely welcome. The work done in the project EU-funded Action on Black Carbon in the Arctic will help us forward on that task, and I sincerely hope that such work would continue also after the project. I thank you all for your attention now and look forward for the question and answers session later, as well as the interesting presentations ahead of us that will bring you more information about many of the aspects I have highlighted in my speech. Thank you for your attention. Back to you, Annika.
Thank you, Carle. And I think there are some really important points of the broader context of both climate and air pollution, and also the global Arctic connections that we can pick up on later. And if you have comments or questions, remember that you can post those in the chat, and we'll get back to them later. So now we move to a presentation about the foundations really for understanding the impact of different policy choices that we have to make, namely the scenarios of future emissions. I welcome Zig Clement, research group leader at the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, to take over the microphone and screen. The floor is yours, Zig.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to thank also the AMAP for coordination of this work, and of course the European Union for funding this activity, and especially building the scenarios that are used in this project, but also in many other activities, including very own AMAP assessment that Carle has mentioned in his speech just seconds ago. I will give you a brief introduction and overview of the outlook for future emissions of black carbon, as well as mitigation opportunities. Next slide, please. To start with, for some of us that are maybe not so familiar with Arctic countries and observer countries, a global map with indication of contribution to black carbon emissions. And on the very bottom on the left side, you see that the dark blue color indicates the contribution of 8 Arctic countries. That is somewhere below 10% of the total emissions of black carbon. While adding it up together with the observer countries that include large countries and large emitters of black carbon like China and India, that amounts to about 50% of global emissions. Next one, please. The structure of emissions varies between the regions. If we look into the left side of that slide, that's a global picture, and you see the gray color indicating residential combustion has been mentioned already earlier. Wood combustion, coal combustion in small inefficient appliances is among the major sources of black carbon. If we focus now on the AC8, which is depicting here Arctic 8 countries, Arctic Council countries, you see that the picture is quite different, actually different also from the observer countries that are representing a large part of global emissions, but very similar structure to the global picture. The Arctic countries have a very strong component. About half of the emissions in 2015 are estimated from transportation. That's mostly diesel engines, and also residential combustion. But what is worth to note is this orange part that is flaring emissions. And this is something not only unique to this region, because emissions from flaring, of course, are also present in other oil-producing areas, but as a percentage of total emissions in the region, this is a very important component. And many of these flares, as I will show later in my presentation, actually are fairly high north. And linking to what Carle was saying, it really matters where black carbon is emitted. Next. I'm adding a little bit color to it. This is really to highlight that contribution within Arctic Council is largely dominated by 3 countries or 2 countries, Russia and the United States, and then Canada. All the other countries on the very left, you see a little yellow about this. These are all the Nordic countries, Scandinavia, that is in absolute terms does not contribute that much of black carbon. For many reasons, also population-wise, very small compared to the rest of the region. But of course, they are all fairly north, so this makes also a difference. On the right side, you see that China and India are by far the biggest contributors from all of the observer countries that include them, as well as Japan, Korea, and several countries in Europe. Next one. This is a brief overview of the scenarios that we have developed within this study. And as I mentioned earlier, they serve a number of modeling exercises. They also used by the community that is developing work assessment of the IPCC for the IPCC as alternative source of data compared to the SSP scenarios used in the IPCC process. So we pretty much have three categories of scenarios that we refer to as Eclipse. That was actually another EU-funded project some time back. And the baseline scenario relies on the IEA World Energy Outlook 2018 that includes national communication to the Paris Agreement. So the reduction of CO2 committed there, and also methane and black carbon for some countries are included in this scenario. And it includes efficient implementation of currently committed environmental legislation. So in a way, it's optimistic because it assumes that all the laws will be executed, and we know from the past that has not been always the case, but we here assume correct execution of these laws. The mitigation cases, there's a number of them. I will highlight here two, really. The first two, this is the maximum technically feasible reduction, and the next one is sustainable development scenario. The first relies on assumption that independent of the economic cost, we are exploring the mitigation potential that is defined in the model to reduce emissions of black carbon that also results in reduction of many other species, including sulfur dioxide and NOx, and as well as methane and many other air pollutants. The sustainable development scenario, on the other hand, is something where the starting point for that is mitigation of climate, and it focuses very much on CO2 mitigation and methane mitigation, while of course reducing fossil fuel use brings a lot of mitigation of air pollutants as well. And this scenario includes also SDG goals that have implications for example, for use of solid fuels for cooking and heating in many regions of the world. And lastly, a scenario I will not mention in further slides is frozen legislation. This is the policy failure scenario, assuming that what would happen if current laws were actually not correctly executed, what kind of penalty in terms of emissions would result from that. Next one, please. This slide shows a global picture, a global evolution of baseline emissions and the mitigation with best available technology as defined in the Gaines model that is used for the development of this scenario. And you see here that about 20% of emissions will be reduced in the current baseline. So according to our estimates, there will be a reduction with assuming implementation of already existing laws and regulations, while there exists a very large potential to mitigate emissions, estimated here at 70% beyond the baseline. That means about 80% compared to 2015. In terms of structure of emissions, I show here only 3 regions. The blue is Arctic, and then observer countries in orange, and the rest of the world in gray. One remarkable thing is that you see that the orange pie declines quite strongly in the baseline, but also in the mitigation scenario on the bottom. And that is because already in the baseline in China and India, there are strong policies to reduce consumption of solid fuels, coal and biomass for residential uses like cooking and heating. So that's part already of their strategy, and that contributes to slightly changing picture globally. Next one, please. This is probably the busiest slide. I will try to guide you through this quickly. Now, you see the same yellow lines depict actually the same lines as you saw on the previous picture, showing the envelope of emissions between the baseline and the yellow dots showing the mitigation scenario with technical measures. While on the bottom of that, you see here a green dotted line that indicates the additional potential that is available from a climate mitigation scenario. So meaning that we would apply the sustainable development scenario consistent with 2 degrees target or even below 2 degree target, and at the same time application of additional measures, indicating that the climate policy alone does not actually produce that large reduction, although I'll come back to that in a second. The CO2 lines on top indicate that the baseline that has been developed here, that's the lighter blue, is very similar to the middle of the road scenario used by the IPCC, which is the SSP2 scenario, which is indicated here on with a dark blue line. Next. The right side of the slide shows now the same, pretty much the same evolution, but for Arctic countries. And you see that in contrast to the global picture, there the baseline is cutting even deeper. There's a significant reduction in the dark yellow line. That's the baseline policies already on the books. And however, at the same time, there is a smaller potential with the climate policies, say smaller potential, assuming that we employ all of the technical mitigation measures. Next one. I would like to highlight here this small area that links to the policy failure in this chart, that what the penalty would be if the policies that were introduced recently were actually not enforced. Next one. And this is just highlighting how large is the additional mitigation potential. Next one. And this thick line indicates a potential for black carbon mitigation if baseline policies, current legislation would remain in place without additional technical measures, but the world would put itself on a sustainable development pathway. So you see here the benefit of the climate mitigation strategy in the Arctic is not very large, while about half of the total mitigation potential through transformation in energy sector, in residential sector, agriculture, could be brought by the Paris Agreement. However, you also should see that it becomes available much slower. This mitigation is much slower. Next one. This is to remind ourselves about the target that the Arctic Council set for, or the Arctic Council set for mitigation by 25 of the up to 33% compared to 2013, but also demonstrate the mitigation potential within the Arctic countries as to which sectors offer that potential. You see in the third column here the mitigation potential, highlighting sectors where reductions could be achieved, and that's about 75% mitigation. And so we'll see here that flaring and households, that's heating with solid fuels, wood mostly, offers the largest potential, while also the green area highlights still problems with agricultural burning, open agricultural burning, that remote sensing shows us. On the slide on the very last, the bar on the right side shows the remaining emissions in 2030 baseline. That's not the climate scenario, that's the baseline scenario that is remaining after implementation of best available measures. Next. This is just highlighting that the 2025 emissions, they are just a little bit off the baseline, as we estimated, a bit off the target of 25 to 33%. At the same time, we have to also remember the uncertainties in these emissions, and so it's not so easy to nail it down, as has been already mentioned in the very beginning. Next one. To come to an end in my presentation, I just want to highlight here, it's a quite busy slide, but if we look at the very top of it and the two pictures that illustrate two important sources, is flaring and forest fires, that highlight the importance of these sources in terms of temperature. So location matters. Next one, please. This is only to illustrate the flaring importance, that it coincides and is seen from space. On the right side, you see the night light image. Next one, please. And that coincides very nicely with the flaring emissions that are shown on the right side compared to the left side of total. Let me conclude, next one, please. That's the last slide, with few key messages. Considering recent trends and policies implemented now on the books, there is a expected reduction of black carbon emissions. The enforcement of current policies matters, but there is a very large potential available in some of the key sectors like residential combustion, flaring, and non-road transportation, as well as waste, especially if we look into observer countries. Additional potential for BC mitigation is consistent with the Paris Agreement, but is limited and mostly motivated by the Sustainable Development Goals. And the final bullet, next one, please. Implementation of climate policies does bring benefit to BC emissions and reduces them. But as a matter of fact, there's no need to wait. Faster opportunities are available, proven technologies out there to reduce rather quickly and quicker emissions of black carbon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sig. And this is really interesting and a lot of information. And I just want to let you know that the slides will be made available because I'm sure many people would like to look at some of the details in them. One of the things I really take with me for this is that the technological potential is there to do a lot. We'll move on directly to our next speaker, Shardul Agrawala, Head of the Environment and Economy Integration Division at OECD's Environment Directorate, who will present on behalf of Elisa Lanzi. But the topic is the same as in the program, the economic benefit of air quality improvements in Arctic Council countries. The floor is yours, Shardul.
Thanks very much, Annika. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll be presenting, Zig has already made the case for the significant technical potential there is to reduce black carbon emissions. And I'd be picking up from where he left off and talking about the social and economic consequences, comparing these metrics between what if we continue on the path of current policies and comparing them to the outcomes that we would have if we were indeed to adopt these best available techniques and technologies. Next slide, please. So in terms of the economic case for improving air quality in the Arctic, just by way of context, and this has already been mentioned, the Arctic Council countries have this aspirational goal to reduce BC emissions by 25 to 33% by 2025 relative to 2013 levels. And, as Zig already mentioned, the policies that are already in place are already leading to significant decreases in emissions of BC as well as other pollutants in the coming decades. And the point that was also mentioned was that we can do a lot more in terms of seeing greater reductions of air pollutants, including of black carbon, through the application of BATs. Now, what we are doing here is we are projecting the biophysical, economic, and health benefits of these ambitious air pollution policies in Arctic Council countries up to 2050. But we are also looking at other scenarios where it's not just the Arctic Council countries acting, but Arctic Council countries plus observer states, and finally Arctic Council countries, observers, and the rest of the world. And we'll be comparing the current legislation and ambitious policies. So next slide, please. So in terms of just one slide on our modeling framework, and here I want to emphasize that we bring our expertise in environment economy modeling at a global level at the OECD, but we are working in close partnership with EASA and the GAINS model that was just presented, but also the Joint Research Center of the European Commission and the TN5 FAST model. And this schematic gives how these models are linked. We make projections of economic activities, not just in the Arctic, but worldwide, using our ENV linkages model. And that leads to projections of emissions of key air pollutants through EASA's model. And eventually we move to concentrations of ground level ozone and fine particulate matter, which leads to impacts, and then the economic analysis. So this is the sequence. So I'd like to acknowledge both EASA and the ECGRC. Next, please. So coming straight to what might be some of the benefits of implementing more ambitious policies in the Arctic Council countries. Next. So the first thing we looked at was exposure of population within the Arctic Council countries to concentrations of fine particulate matter, which is above the WHO guideline of 10 microgram per meter cube. And black carbon, just to connect it to the focus of the conference, is obviously a key element of fine particulate matter. So if we persist with currently legislated policies, by mid-century, the Arctic Council countries would have 18 million people exposed to PM2.5 concentrations above 10 micrograms per meter cube. But if the best available technologies that Zing was mentioning were to be implemented just in the Arctic Council countries alone, the population exposed to these levels of concentrations would drop to 1 million. So it's an 18-fold decrease, or a decrease of 17 million less people exposed to these concentrations. Next, please. Now, moving beyond exposure, of course, exposure to air pollutants has a range of health impacts. One of the key impacts is, of course, premature mortality. And as a result of moving to these ambitious policies, we will save roughly 4 out of 10 premature deaths due to air pollution annually by 2050 across the AC8 countries. And these are the numbers for Canada, Russia, the Nordics as a group, and the United States. And a total of 84,000 premature deaths per year could be avoided if we were to move to the adoption of the best available technologies. Next, please. And of course, premature mortality is just one health outcome. There are a whole range of other outcomes, for example, asthma cases, hospitalizations, sick days, and bronchitis and other illnesses. And we have quantified the numbers. For example, 3 million days of asthma in children could be avoided by 2050 in the AC8 countries through the adoption of these best available technologies. And the numbers are there for the other impacts also on the slide. Next. So the next question, obviously, that comes in quite frequently to us at the OECD is, but how much would it cost to implement these technologies, even if this technological potential exists? And how do these costs compare to the benefits to the economy? And so here we quantify the market costs and benefits. In blue, you have the market benefits, because many of the impacts I described, particularly linked to illness, lead to drops in labor productivity. So avoided illness would have a positive impact on labor productivity, which in turn affects GDP. Likewise, another set of impacts is agricultural productivity, which I've not talked about, but that also has a positive impact on GDP. So those benefits are shown in blue. And of course, you'll see that the benefits are heterogeneous across the different countries in the Arctic Council 8. And then, of course, we also looked at the costs of deploying these technologies. Now, the costs of deploying these technologies here are not just the investment costs. We're looking at the macroeconomic costs, because when you deploy the technology, it may also generate economic activity elsewhere in the economy, for example, to service the technology or to provide the relevant expertise. So it's not the installation cost of the technology. We're looking at the macroeconomic costs. And sometimes the macroeconomic costs might end up being less than the installation costs if you have to take a very narrow lens. And you see that the costs in yellow, again, as a percentage of GDP. And in the cross marks, you see where the net balance is for the countries shown in the chart. The bottom line message here I want to underscore is, for the Arctic Council country, the 8 countries taken as a whole, there is no net negative impact on GDP as a result of deploying these best available technologies. Next. It's also important to mention that market costs and benefits do not capture everything. So, for example, a lot of they do not capture premature deaths. They do not capture the pain and suffering as a result of respiratory illness. But these can be valued through techniques which are called non-market valuation. And we have conducted the valuation analysis also to look at these non-market benefits of more stringent control of these emissions. And the numbers are presented on a per capita basis, because obviously the populations are very different across these countries in this graph. In total, the welfare benefits of deploying these best available technologies would be roughly $300 billion by 2050 for the 8 Arctic Council countries. Next, please. And this is my final slide. The point I'd like to make is that the benefits that we have quantified are actually a significant underestimate, because there are many things we have not taken into account. For example, we have focused on the impacts of ground level ozone and PM 2.5. We have not looked at the health impacts of other air pollutants. We have also focused on a selected set of health impacts on public health and agriculture. But there are other impacts, for example, so we've looked at respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, but there are a whole range of other health impacts which new science is showing is linked to air pollution. And those could also, in further research, be quantified, and that would certainly tip the benefits side of the equation even higher. And then, of course, beyond health and agriculture, there are other economic impacts, for example, impacts on ecosystems and impacts on infrastructure, which are not captured. And then finally, the impacts related to global climate. So the bottom line is, from an economic perspective, there is no net cost to the economy for the 8 Arctic Council countries collectively if we were to deploy these best available technologies. These market costs and benefits do not capture a whole range of welfare benefits, which are even more significant. And even the economic benefits are likely to be underestimated because of a whole range of things which are not factored in. So there is a very strong economic and social case for action beyond the technical case that was already mentioned in previous speeches. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shardul. This is very interesting, and I think especially the welfare, the human welfare gains that could actually be gotten from applying best available technologies. And I also want to highlight that most of this, or all of this, is probably available in a just released report from OECD that you will find on their website. I'm sure we can find a way to get the link out to you all so you can read more about this. Thank you very much, Shardul. Before we open up for discussion, we will hear some insights from the mapping of the policy landscape that has been done as a key activity in the EU-funded action on black carbon in the Arctic. And those results will be presented by Stefan Åström, senior researcher at the Swedish Environmental Research Institute, together with Mikael Hildén, director of the Finnish Environment Institute. And I believe Mikael will start, right?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. We will start with the presentation, as Annika mentioned, about mapping the policy options that have been referred to in various of the presentations already we've heard. Next slide. We'll start with convincing you of the key messages, and then we will justify them in the talk. I think the main thing that we signal here is that there are several policy options, as both Sig and Shardul highlighted. There are several possible actions, and that means that there are also several different pathways towards reducing the emissions. And so by mapping this policy landscape, we can identify and also prioritize, because there are differences between the different actions. And to achieve this, we do need coordination and mutual learning as a key starting point. Next slide. You already saw in Sig's presentation also the diversity of black carbon sources. And from a policy point of view, this implies obviously that we do need different types of actions, because some of them are local and diffuse, such as the domestic heating, and then others are large point sources. The flaring at oil and gas installation is a case in point. Also, big ships can be seen as moving point sources that are important. And so there's a need to both understand these emissions and to be able to identify what kind of action is relevant for each particular set of actions that then can be both tracked and evaluated in order to improve the policies. Next slide. And so this is what is, in a sense, in the EU-funded action on black carbon, that we have the work components both for improved knowledge of the different sources and actions, increasing the awareness in communication with stakeholders, a broader public discourse, and then to come to the more technical advice on the actual actions and then analyzing possible scenarios. And next slide. There's a whole suite of different reports that I encourage you to read. You will have access to those through the website, so will not present them, but you can see that they cover a wide range of different topics related to the question of black carbon. Next. And what we are here today about is mainly about the third component, looking at the technical advice and the scenario analysis, where the main objective of the whole action comes to the fore, in that we need to contribute to the development of the collective responses to black carbon emissions. And that has been said, we need to map the different policy options and identify those which are of particular relevance. So at this stage, I'll hand over to my colleague, Stefan. Next.
Thank you very much, Mikael. And next slide. So our focus then has been on finding actions that are important for this action, well, for this black carbon problem in the Arctic. And the focus here has been on both on monitoring aspects as well as on emission reductions. The monitoring is of particular importance here because, as you know, well, at least some of you know, that air pollution policies are based on very close links between science policy and always try to be based on the sound science for this. But for this challenge with black carbon in the Arctic, the more efforts into monitoring of BC emissions from countries and regions, as well as monitoring of concentrations and deposition of black carbon in the wider Arctic region are necessary. The earlier project reports show that we need more knowledge and info on the concentration situation in the Arctic. These types of monitoring are essential if policymakers like or would like to have a cost-effective policy to reduce the problem. And cost effectiveness is, at least in most European countries, a very important criteria for environmental policy. And then in addition to the monitoring that we've looked into, we've also looked into emission reductions from certain key sectors, where we have the domestic solid fuel heating. It's in this slide and the forthcoming slides called domestic heating. ZIG presented them as residential sector earlier on. So many names for the same thing. We've also looked into emission reduction from gas flaring, from the oil and gas extraction sectors, the maritime shipping, as well as various types of diesel engines and open burning. Open burning measures involves both those done with the planned burning of agricultural residuals or those forest wildfires. Now, note that these actions to reduce emissions from these different types of sectors are very different in their nature. You have, for example, the diesel regulations, that is a very technical research supporting this, whilst in this open burning emission reduction is more about practices, etc., and onwards. Next slide, please. So to give a more example of this, I'll just move my slide as well. We give examples from the domestic heating and the maritime shipping, and here you can see the large range of variance in these types of actions that we are discussing in our work. So we have for the domestic heating, you have actions ranging from educational campaign, burn right or correct combustion or whatever you would like to call it. So basically teaching people how to use their stoves and appliances. We have actions in shapes of economic incentives and all the way from economic incentives into regulations of markets, etc., strengthening of wider agreements. So all those fits into the same area of domestic heating measures. But then at the same time, when we look at maritime shipping, we have a very different type of action where we have rather regulations and agreements necessary for large international organizations such as the IMO. And all of these together will contribute to emission reductions of black carbon affecting the Arctic, but they are very different in their nature, and this is something that we have to adapt to in our work. Next slide, please. Yeah, perfect. So we also need to consider and have tried to find the ways or the actions where cooperation is of special interest, if you like. And again, with these wide range of actions that we've presented, it's evident that one size does not fit all, but we find that there are certain things that needs to be highlighted, and 4 of these are the harmonization of regulation and criteria, working together to have a more consistent regulation scheme, basically. It's also important with sharing efforts for development of information systems. Basically, sharing and joint development means either paying for it together or sharing with manpower necessary to do the work. Exchange of good practice, basically making sure that information gets out there, that knowledge is disseminated. And of course, research, development, and innovation for low emission technologies and practices, as well as production processes. So new knowledge, more or less, if you like. The thing is that this cooperation, it's not necessary that it happens by itself. It needs encouragement, it needs time, especially when we are investing or looking into these actions that transcends across sectors. I mean, information systems do not emerge on their own. With that, I would like to move to the next slide, please. The beautiful part of it is that there are many ongoing activities that we've seen that are heading in the right directions. As been mentioned, there are already joint action across the Arctic Council working groups that are setting quite good examples and open up for new windows of opportunities, as we like to call it. It's an old term, but windows of opportunities for cooperation to reduce this problem. And there is also an international engagement and discussions already ongoing between the European Union, the Air Convention, IMO, the World Bank, and several important Arctic Council countries. And in some cases, even when these actions that we are discussing in our work, when they are predominantly national in their nature, there can still be much gained through international exchange of ideas and experiences, etc. Next slide, please. So now we want to move from the specific actions that and why, in what way and how they can benefit from international cooperation, moving on to the monitoring part of the actions that we've looked into. And here, just as a reminder of the importance of it, it's basically a question of knowing how much black carbon is emitted and where it is emitted. We need to know this so that we can focus the actions on the right sector and on the right region. We need better information there. We need regular emission inventories from the countries and sectors. But we then also need to know basically what type of black carbon, especially how much black carbon reaches the Arctic from these regions. As been stated before, if we implement all the available technologies, we can reduce black carbon emissions by 70% between 2010 and 2030. But how much of those 70% will affect the Arctic, either through transfer of heat or through transfer of the actual emissions? So with that, I would like to leave the floor to Mikael again for the closing slides. Next slide, please.
Yes, thank you. So the point about all of this is that what we are talking about is really a major socio-technical transition. Now, this has been referred to already by the ambassador and others in the early speeches. They do not happen on their own. They need to be taken over and be pushed forward through gradual but very conscious actions. And the point we are trying to make is that there needs to be an ownership. Luckily, as Stefan also presented, there are quite a number of bodies and organizations already involved, some of them leaning more in this yellow color to the production of new knowledge and guidance on what to do, and then to more policy-oriented bodies which make the actual real decisions. And by these joint actions, we can then conduct the development in such a way that the wiggly line indicating the reduction towards 70% that Sig's presentation already highlighted is actually becoming reality. But it doesn't become reality unless there is this kind of interaction between different bodies, different actors. So both parallel and joint implementation, allocation of resources, and strengthening of the monitoring and evaluation of the actions, because some of the actions may not work the way we've intended, and then there needs to be an experimentation with not only technical solutions, but also an experimentation with some of the policy actions that can give incentives to individual actors to change their activities in such a way that the emission reductions are achieved. So next slide. And that boils down to the questions that we throw in for the coming discussion. That first of all, we know that there are these large number of bodies and organizations involved, and so by enhancing the cooperation and coordination, we can achieve something. But then we can also, of course, always ask, is there a need for additional fora for this cooperation and joint action to actually happen, or is it something that the existing ones can respond to by bridging barriers and reducing the silos that may still exist in areas? With that, we will conclude our presentation, and thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing us right into this science policy interface where we will be spending, I think, much of the rest of the time in this meeting. And I'm very happy to see that questions are rolling in and comments are rolling in the chat, and we also have received some already beforehand. So I will start right away firing questions, and we'll see who takes them of the group that's here. The first question is, what do you think is more effective in reducing black carbon emissions? Technical measures, advanced technology, or non-technical measures, guidance, informations to final users? Even, of course, both of them are relevant. So maybe that's something for Stefan to comment on.
I sure can. I noted that the question came from Tiziano, so I hope Tiziano is here and listening. And if so, I want to say hi, Tiziano. Thank you for the question. The work we've done here hasn't focused on the non-technical measures or behavioral change measures very much, but with respect to the changes in combustion behavior, basically burn right or correct combustion. So we haven't done a full and fair comparison of behavioral change measures or technical measures. So there is a limited amount of non-technical or behavioral change measures in our work. I would think, though, that given the importance of gas flaring and transport sector emissions, that the lion's share for black carbon should, with the measures we're looking at, should be on the technical measure side, unless you start accounting for those clear CO2 measures that have co-beneficial black carbon emission reduction features. That would be my best guess, basically.
Mikael.
Yeah, I could add to that obviously, and as you indicated, Annika, that they do interact. So the technical measures do not get adopted unless there is also an awareness and a willingness to adopt those. So we know that domestic heating is a major source, and people will not invest in new stoves unless there is also an awareness and a recognition that this makes sense. So to create the market for the new technical devices, there's also a need to realize and having the awareness. So in that sense, they are truly interlinked. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that actually addresses one of the other questions we had. What would it take to actually reduce emissions from burning of wood in domestic situations? I think that's one of the more complex things where you really have to get at behavior.
Yeah, I can.
Yes.
I mean, I just want to emphasize the importance of that particular aspect. I mean, I'm all in favor of the importance of this type of measure, but as a northerner, I'm going to go down to my cottage tomorrow, and I will use my stove. I will, and I love using my stove. I'm willing to do quite much to fix that. I have been practicing on the burn right technique, so I'm getting the hang of it. But I feel that we need to look deeply into how to convince me to stop using that particular stove. I can be a test rabbit if somebody wants to try it out.
And I think we need to recognize there's a reason we do things the way we do now, and we need incentives somehow to change. What's the situation with diesel engines, which of course you show that was a rather important part of the emissions in Arctic Council member states? But why aren't we getting more done to retrofit all diesel engines? Who would like to take that one?
Zig here. I can chip in my comment. I think everybody has an opinion about transportation. That's one of the sectors that we all know better, I guess. But one of the things about diesel is there's been a lot of campaigning about that, and there's been a lot of technology development, and they became really clean. NOx is really remaining problem, and even that has been addressed recently. Some people claim it's effective already on the road. Now, black carbon from diesel is effectively resolved with working technology. The question here is if that technology penetrates at the right speed into all sources of diesel engines. And it's not about the road transportation that has been advancing very quickly in most parts of the Arctic Council countries, but the diesel engines in use in non-road transportation. A lot of these machines are second-hand machines that will be moving around the planet for very long. And also the diesel generators that you mentioned. There is a lot of communities that rely strongly on 24/7 on diesel generators that are not often up to date. And this is where local importance of this emission sources is certainly warranted, and also quick fixing of them is important.
How would the quick fixing would be done?
Yes.
Because
sorry,
that's what we need to get to.
Right. So particulate filters that have been effectively implemented and started on engines in cars and diesel trucks are applicable to all the other internal combustion engines, and they've been shown to work. It's a question, of course, of willingness and funding made available, but technology is there, and it can be used effectively and applied.
We have a rather specific question when it comes to the large share of transport in the Arctic, and what share of that is shipping versus other transport.
Sorry, I will continue for a second. I've tried to write this up also, so there is an answer that is written in the replies somewhere further down, because I was not able to immediately respond next to it, but I think I tried to say that. So shipping has been elevated very often as a very important source, and I'm not claiming it is not an important source, but put it in the perspective of total emissions, the contribution of shipping to black carbon is not very large. Location of these emissions, of course, is another thing, and the fact that opening new Arctic routes, potentially also with climate warming, climate change, might aggravate the situation and add to the problem. But in terms of absolute emissions, we are speaking of something like 1% of global emissions comes from maritime, maybe somewhere between 0.5 to 2%. We don't know that well. And in the Arctic, again, that percentage is also small and even smaller. Of course, if we move very high north where there is no other sources, the situation is different. But in absolute terms, it's not a very large source of emissions.
Mm-hmm. The IMO, of course, is the key body involved in this at the international level, and one of the questions we have in the chat is in a sense reflects on why this decisions were not more stringent, and why do you think the EU failed to act to put these measures in place, as the question was posed in the chat? What would it take to get more efficient and stronger measures from the IMO to make sure that emissions from shipping do not increase in the Arctic? Anyone dare to take that one? No? Mikael?
Well, I mean, of course, and that's one of the points we raised, that we do have in some areas of emissions, we do have these very large institutions, and it's a very long process to get anything through a very large institution, and we all know that from empirical observation. So there are, and that's, I guess, the simple answer, that there are many interests that are in competition with one another and do need to agree before things come forward. So it means that it's a question about creating incentives, and the IMO has focused on the issue. And I would argue that there's also this kind of signal effect, that even though the strict decisions have not been made, the activity itself has already sent signal to the developers of shipping engines, of the whole shipping industry has recognized it. Of course, it happens more slowly than we might wish for, but it still gives a signal even before the actual measures have been implemented. So that is the positive side of it. Then the negative is, as I said, it's a political process where not the EU nor anybody else has exclusive power to actually make it happen just like with a snap of the finger. But yeah, maybe Carla can give some views from the political side.
Well, thank you for pitching it to me. We have a negotiation team, of course, from Finland to working hard on these issues, not only this, but also other environmental issues that are on the table in the IMO. What I would perhaps like to say here is that I echo what Zig said. I mean, it is several times more important, the emission of black carbon, what happens in the Arctic than more south. So definitely we have to keep a close eye on what's happening in the area itself. And secondly, we have noted with concern that there are studies indicating and movement of ships indicating an increase in the activity, which is why we should pay attention to this. And of course, I haven't been in our delegation to the IMO, so I cannot. I don't know actually about the debate happening there. So maybe this is all I would like to comment on my behalf. Thank you.
I would like to move to another other sectors that's actually a growing concern, and that's open fires and wildland fires, and including the risk for increasing fires with climate change in the Arctic. And we have a question to what extent both changes in fire risk and also efforts to control fires, how that figures into the models that you present. Maybe that's a question for you, Sig.
That's a difficult one, I have to admit. Now, because we are quite shy of trying to model ourselves development of fires and evolution of fires, independent if we would consider climate change or not. So we are relying on what is known from the past, and then try to forecast certain trends. There is evidence, of course, that improved management might affect changes in fire regimes or frequency of fires. And of course, there is a strong fraction believing, and I'm not saying this is wrong, I'm saying that there's a number of people saying that most of the fires actually are anthropogenic. And the question is then, to what extent can we really control these fires that are anthropogenic, if we will be able to enforce that? We have not been modeling that explicitly. So we have relied on the SSP, on the climate, actually SSP scenarios that were prepared for the IPCC in terms of evolution of wildfires. And that's a bit conservative, maybe. Maybe more can be done, but we have not found enough evidence to include that explicitly in a model in a systematic way.
And of course, that is one of the really real difficulties, since changes in fires will be affected by climate, which in turn will affect emissions. So it is really complex. But it's also one of those issues that even within the Arctic is a health concern. So, Stefan, did you want to get in here? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to add to Claudia here, rather to Nancy as well, whilst we're on the burning, Nancy French in California, on this, the plan there's to reduce unplanned fire by having controlled fires. And I don't think we are not discussing this in the work we've been doing on the actions. And correct me if I'm wrong, Sig, but that's not a measure that we include in the models either, as of yet, at least. But I think it's an interesting avenue that we need to look more into, because it's definitely one. Go, Sig.
No, I just want to comment that we did not include this specifically in the mitigation portfolio within this work, but in the scenarios, we have been looking into something that IPCC has been considering as reduced in a sustainable development scenario, efforts also to reduce actually frequency of fires, of naturally occurring fires, and or anthropogenically occurring fires, but something that is called wildfires. And yes, there is an important contribution, of course, to emissions of reductions. If we emissions of black carbon also, because globally about 25 to 30% of emissions of black carbon is associated with open burning of biomass. So there is a leverage to do something about it, but we cannot obviously eliminate all fires. There's a natural cycle to fires. There's a need for regular fires.
I think I want to change track a little bit now and go into the health impacts to bring Shardul into the discussion. Of course, fires is a health issue as well. Looking at your new report and in your presentation, you focused really on costs in the Arctic Council member countries and economic benefits. But you also, we've seen from the other presentations that the rest of the world, both the observer countries and other countries that are not observers, are really important in terms of black carbon emissions. Can you say something about the economic benefits and welfare benefits on the global scale of reducing emissions of black carbon?
Right. No, thanks for that question. So I think the number I gave you for the welfare benefits for the Arctic Council 8 was of the order of $300 billion by mid-century. If you look at the welfare benefits of the observer countries also undertake similarly ambitious policies, the welfare benefits to the observer countries would be of the order of 1.5 to 2 trillion US dollars, and obviously because these are some of the observers are obviously very densely populated and rapidly developing, with the populations which are far greater than many of the Arctic countries who are exposed to dangerous air pollutants. So the welfare benefits are definitely orders of magnitude higher in the observed countries. And if there's global action, then the welfare benefits are of the order of 3 trillion US dollars. So yes, if there is ambitious action in the observer countries and other countries, there may be a benefit to the Arctic, but there is a significant local and regional benefit also through reduced health impacts.
Well, of course, the health impacts of black carbon have been known for quite some time. That is not new in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think putting numbers, putting what actually the economic benefits of taking measures against black carbon emissions, what difference do you think that will make in the policy debate?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the things I'd like to say is that the health impacts we're looking at are, black carbon is an important component to them. It's an important component to fine particulate matter. But the impact is coming from the fine particulate matter or ground level ozone. Those are the impact channels we're looking at. And I mean, for us, obviously we just launched the report yesterday, but we've done a previous report on the economic consequences of air pollution, and that was a global analysis, it was still striking to people to just look at the sheer magnitude. So, for example, even in this presentation, I mentioned 84,000 premature deaths could be avoided if the Arctic Council 8 moved to more ambitious policies. It's still, even if you know that there are adverse health impacts, it's still striking to see what the impacts might be. Or the numbers I gave for children who would not have so many days of children not having asthma, but something people can relate to. So numbers do help focalize attention. And that's the same thing, and ultimately feeding into the economic analysis. You know, this question always comes up. The engineers say that, of course, the technologies are available, but of course, those technologies would come at a cost. So unless you put those two in the same equation, you know, you just have a much stronger argument if you can look at all the evidence, the science, the technologies, and the social impacts and the economics. You know, that is a much more powerful package with numbers.
I just got a question that was directly to you. See if it doesn't flip away here. There. It seems like it's only Russia that experiences a net cost for reducing emissions of black carbon in terms of health, while their emissions clearly affect us all. What signals do you think that should send to the other Arctic Council countries?
That is not a question I can present to you what the numbers are. I think, I mean, there is a reason. I mean, I think the bigger the technological challenge might be to move the size of the emissions, and also how much you need to move to adopt best available technologies. So there is some, intellectual basis why the cost might be higher for Russia. But in terms of what that means, in terms of how to prioritize those actions, that's a question for the member states to decide. Given the challenges, how can they help Russia overcome these challenges?
But of course, that's also a generic question. I think any of you can pick up. Maybe Carly. How do we deal with this thing that the cost might end up on one party, and the benefits on another, or one part of the world and different countries or different sectors within? How, in terms of the politics of that, Carly, do you have any comments on that?
Sure, many comments if you wish, but maybe I could first start with the sort of a national perspective. I think it is important to have these numbers that OECD has provided us, that we can see which sectors, which actors of the society bear the cost, because then we can also see, on the other hand, then where do the benefits lie. So, for example, in our case, if we see that certain industries, certain households bear the costs, but then again, in our national welfare system, we get benefits and savings. Then we can think of course, subsidy policies or similar taxational policies to compensate for these things, and everyone is happy, sort of. And this maybe to some extent goes, of course, beyond national borders. In a regional setting, one can, of course, operate like it's done in the UNECE with sort of emission caps, or within the EU also with emission caps that we agree together, taking into account the impacts, as we have talked before, the multiple impacts that we have there. We can also think about our life cycle emissions in more general. If we buy certain commodity from another country, look at the whole life cycle and see what information that brings us. So there's no easy answer, of course, for a international system that would sort of compensate, but there are many avenues where we can influence, I think.
Mikael.
Yes, I want to follow up, I think, on the economic aspect. It is, of course, that we are talking about, as I said in the final slide, that we are talking about a socio-technical transition, and whether that amounts to short-term economic benefits is also quite a challenge. That we do have long-term economic change. We know the necessity to get away from fossil fuels more broadly. We need to reduce pollutions generally. Those countries that are able to develop their resource use and their innovations that can take us out of this dilemma will benefit in the long run. But that's extremely difficult to get into the type of models that the OECD is working on right now. So as Shardul was saying, this gives a baseline and a starting point, but it's not the definite truth that you would be able to judge all policies for the past or the future 15, 20 years.
Stefan.
Yeah, I think in addition to Mika there, I think it's also important here for the audience to recognize that the numbers that Zig presented us, he mentioned something that I think is very important, which is proven technologies. And this is where this air pollution work in some way differs from parts of the climate change debate, where there's much focus on prospective technologies. But all these technologies and the numbers that have been presented here are from technologies that we know of today. They work, they are on the market. So all this stuff is known technologies currently available. So this is, I think, is an important stress to show that this is a conservative estimate in that way on the potential to reduce emissions even further.
And it's, of course, actually a very optimistic message. We have the technology. It's a matter about doing things. We are getting towards closing time, but before we do that, I would like to give each of you a chance to say, very short, your number one priority for next steps in reducing emissions of black carbon. What is it? Who goes first? And keep it short.
I think the implementation of existing policies and adjusting the screw so to make the policies a little bit more demanding, that would be the starting point. Thanks.
Maybe I can pick up from there. I mean, we obviously are encountered with the challenge of scaling up these solutions that Stefan and Zig, for example, highlighted, and we all have addressed. So the scale up challenge, how we can move forward with that. That's it from me. Thank you.
Yeah. And
Stefan.
I would argue that it's time for the Arctic countries to start preparing for even more ambitious policy ambitions for the period after 2025. It's about time to start preparing for that now, I would say.
And Zig, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I thought I will leave myself the most difficult task that is now left to Shardul, actually, because we will exploit all of the options. So my comment would be about the link to climate policies, because very often this is highlighted that long-term transformations in climate policies are solutions to both climate and air pollution problems, including also black carbon. And indeed, they bring reductions of black carbon, but we can do better, we can do cleaner. Some of the technologies and sources are actually not active part of climate strategy, including wood burning in Stefan's stove. That's not part of the climate strategy of Sweden, I believe, but it should be part of the strategy to reduce black carbon.
And Shardul.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to hardest. I would say the thing that's still missing, at least in the discussions we had today and previous discussions I've been part of, is how to change incentives for individual and private behavior. We've talked about sectors, we've talked about industries, we've talked about technologies, but ultimately it's the choices. How do we get Stefan to, and his wood stove? I mean, it comes back to that. How do you maintain traditions, but how do you move away? And one thing that's quite important there is prices, for example. So it's the price of diesel, for example, are the environmental externalities factored into it? So prices, as well as other, what the behavioral nudges, that aspect, I think, needs to also be looked at while we look at big sectors and economies and technologies.
And with that, I think we have to close this session. And thank you, all of you, Mikael, Stefan, Shardul, Zig, and Carle for your insights. And I just want to highlight that there is a poll coming up where you can also give your thoughts on some of these topics that we have discussed. And I'll leave the word over to Paul.